We are now beginning unit number 3 for the course, and what this unit essentially does is it goes back to the title of the course and says, what the heck even does this all mean? What the heck even is Western culture? Because our class is Women in Western Culture, and most people signed up for this class without thinking to themselves, what even is Western culture? Most of you probably just assumed I have some idea of what that is. I'm immersed in it right now, and it has really clear guidelines, a really clear definition. You might have said to yourself, I can certainly point at something and say that's not Western culture, right? Or point to something and say that is Western culture. But this next section, this first unit, kind of takes this idea of Western culture as this clear, bounded concept and says, you know what, Western culture is no longer really clearly defined, really clearly bound. And that's important to talking about how women are affected by what Western culture is and has become. So far, our discussion, our study of Western culture has really been fundamentally based on the assumption that there is a clear delineation between the West and between the East. Now, that assumption, though, that we haven't really challenged yet in this class is based on a lot of really bad logic. So, first, the idea that countries or parts of the world, in this case the East and the West, have clear and impenetrable boundaries, right? I might ask, for example, where Israel or where Japan or where China fall into our understandings of East and West as we understand them differently on a geographic level, on a political level, and on a cultural level. It's also based on the belief that there is no exchange over those boundaries, right? Which is particularly important to the study of culture because cultural artifacts and cultural practices are rapidly exchanged across national borders and from what we might consider the West to the East, right? And finally, and more kind of in general, that the relations of one part of the world are independent from the relations of other parts of the world, right? Now, as we're going to discuss throughout this lecture and throughout this section in the class, in this day and age, the rapid exchange of culture, right, cultural practices, cultural ideologies, cultural artifacts across large distances really complicates this picture. Now, the term that many scholars use to capture this moment in global society is the term transnational. And this is not the same thing as saying globalization, which we're going to talk about a bit later in the lecture. But as the term hits, trans, right, meaning about crossing across, transnational refers to the effects of the changing and we might say decreasing role of national borders in determining the structure of human societies, specifically the increasing flow and exchange of people, ideas, and material across national boundaries sorry, I lost myself there, as well as the growth of political and economic structures that operate globally. Okay, so when we're talking about transnationalism, we're really talking about a moment where the nation ceases to be the site at which power operates most consistently or in the most sort of prominent ways, right? So if you go back not too long ago, there weren't very many institutions of global governance, right? There weren't many things like the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the United Nations, right? NATO, things like this. If you go back not too long, what you had were alliances drawn between individual countries, but none of these sort of global governance structures, right? And that indicates that the role of the nation as this kind of primary site of the organization of power is certainly changing and perhaps even decreasing. So again, just to reiterate, whenever we're talking about transnational, you should think to yourself, the nation is becoming less important. So this term, which will come up throughout the lecture, is also a useful framework for discussing another number of key concepts. So the idea or the effects of Western culture on women spread across the globe, right, are now being affected by transnational processes of cultural exchange. But also women are organizing across national borders, something that we'll look at in a lot more detail in the next unit when we look at how women outside of the West, right, outside of the geographic West, are responding to the effects of Western culture. So, to summarize, studying Western culture effectively involves a number of scholarly assumptions for the next 2 units. First, that Western culture is influenced by non-Western cultures in ways that create overlap between the two. Again, we're pushing against this idea that there's a clear cultural line between the West and the East. that Western cultures often try to construct themselves as the opposite of and opposed to non-Western cultures, and that this construction is a matter of knowledge power, right? So in other words, the way in which we've come to even know about or judge or create knowledge about what constitutes civilization, for example, is based off of our own sorts of ideologies that we have about Western culture and our inability to be reflexive about our judging of different cultures, right? Another assumption that we're operating on is that Western pop culture is often imposed upon non-Western societies through a range of political, economic, and culturally imperialist practices. And finally, that non-Western peoples use Western and non-Western forms of cultural production to engage in cultural anti-imperial politics. In other words, as we'll look a lot in the next unit, that people outside of the purview of the West kind of co-opt, as we talked about with counterculture, co-opt Western cultural products and use them in various political ways. Now, transnationalism, while not the exact same thing as globalization, is usually taking place at the same time that globalization is. And in a lot of ways, they're overlapping. So globalization refers broadly to the economic, social, cultural, and political processes of integration that result from the expansion of transnational economic production, migration, communications, and technologies. So this is just like a really, really brief overview of a concept that's, I'm sure, very, very familiar to most people. But the term globalization normally has two kind of dimensions, economic and political. Economically, globalization refers to a set of processes that include trade liberalization, deregulation of economic markets and business practices, privatization, elimination of social programs, and the movement of businesses outside of their national homes are all part of globalization, right? And as you'll notice, a lot of these things relate to transnationalism, such as the moving of businesses outside of their original national homes. Now, on a political level, the role of the nation-state, as evidenced in the sentence above, shrinks, right, being replaced with privatized services and the growth of transnational political and economic entities like the World Health Organization, United Nations, NATO, World Bank, IMF, and non-governmental organizations, non-profits, the World Trade Organization, the European Union, countless other entities. So, globalization and transnationalism can both be taking place at the same time, but you can also have instances where you have globalization taking place that doesn't evidence transnationalism. And what I mean by that is whereas in every instance where the role of the nation is becoming less important or decreasing, every instance of transnationalism is taking place within the context of globalization. However, you can have something become globalized, okay, without necessarily reducing the importance of the nation state, okay? So, for example, if the United States were to have the United States government organize arms contracts with another country so that U.S. arms manufacturers were producing something here and sending it somewhere else, right? That would be evidence of the ongoing process of globalization, right? Restructuring things on a global level. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a instance of transnationalism because of the fact that the United States government as a nation is still really important to that overall kind of equation, right? Now, all of this is really important. However, all of this discussion typically when people talk about transnationalism or when they talk about globalization, what people typically think of is they think about politics and they think of economics. They think of our ability to order a TV from China and have it appear at our door the next morning, right? However, less frequently do people think about culture. And when they do, they typically still end up thinking about this sort of surface culture approach, right? So what, for example, is in what ways do folks consume cultural products that come from outside of the United States, that originate from outside of the United States? What are ways that you all do that?
Anime.
Okay. Anime, so watching anime or, yeah. Okay, other folks? Everybody just sticks to their own culture and doesn't ever Toe the line, yeah.
Drinking tea that's from a different country.
Okay. Cool. Drinking tea from a different country, yeah.
Eating food.
Like where? I mean, we have to talk. But it's still a great example, right? Other folks? Yeah.
In Denver, they have like the Dragon Boat Festival and stuff like
Oh, okay, okay. So, right, yeah.
that. Sushi.
Sushi, okay. Eating sushi, all right. Yeah.
It's like the entirety of Tucson Meet Yourself.
The entirety of Tucson Meet Yourself, yeah, exactly. Which, if you haven't done it, is fantastic. It's like a food coma waiting to happen, but it's really great, right? So, exactly. All these things are really good examples, but all these things are examples that mostly come from surface culture, right? So, if most people were to think about the ways in which they're affected by globalization, a lot of people in the United States would talk about the general availability of a diversity of cultural products at our supermarkets, at our restaurants, right? Stuff like that. However, we might not care to look at deep cultural aspects of exchange, right? And we might also not care to look at the ways in which this exchange is by no means equal. So whereas we here in the United States, right, experience globalization, for example, by being able to go out and eat at a bunch of different restaurants from all over the world, right? A lot of people in non-Western places might say that the way that they experience globalization is through the increasing ubiquity of Western products and the decreasing availability of local products, right? So the way in which people would narrate the experience of globalization might be different. And this is important for studying culture because on a cultural level, globalization and transnationalism are taking place. However, they're not taking place in equal ways. And one of the main ways that we talk about this, I'll pause really quickly and say this lecture is essentially laying out a big conceptual sketch of different terms that are going to be really important for us for this whole second half of the semester. Cultural imperialism being one of them. So cultural imperialism is the cultural extension of imperialism, the promotion of the culture and economy of one nation over another, often continuing in lieu of the formal political and military control associated with imperialism historically. So when you think about what constituted imperialism or what constituted colonialism historically, you generally think of potentially military control, potentially invasion, right? Typically direct economic and political control. Even if you think about what you learned in U.S. history about the United States before the American Revolution, right, the way in which the control of the United States by England was talked about, right, was in this sort of imperialistic or colonial sort of way, right, colonialist sort of way. Now, most of the formal operations, military and political and economic control, right, have ceased to exist in that sort of direct way. However, the effects of imperialism remain, right? We still see massive inequality in terms of income, in terms of healthcare, right? In terms of all these things between imperial, right, and formerly colonized nations across the world. So one of the ways in which we say, well, how the hell is this still happening if all these political mechanisms of imperialism have ceased existing? One of the ways it keeps happening is through cultural imperialism, right? So it is the cultural hegemony of industrialized or economically influential countries which determine the general cultural values and standardized civilizations throughout the world. Terms such as media imperialism, structural imperialism, cultural dependency and domination, cultural synchronization, ideological imperialism, electronic imperialism. These are all terms that have been used to describe the same basic notion of cultural imperialism, the promotion of one country's culture onto others, right, across others, and oftentimes in ways that involve very specific structural relations, right, and very specific institutional practices used to promote those cultures, right? So, two authors in the field of transnational cultural studies kind of put their argument in their description of cultural imperialism this way. Imperialism is the conquest and control of one country by a more powerful one. Cultural imperialism signifies the dimensions of the process that go beyond economic exploitation or military force. In the history of colonialism, the educational and media systems of many third world countries have been set up as replicas of those in Britain, France, or the United States and carry their values. Western advertising has made further inroads, as have architectural and fashion styles. Subtly but powerfully, the message has often been insinuated that Western cultures are superior to the cultures of the third world, right? We might ask ourselves, why is it that when we go to other countries, anywhere in the global south, anywhere outside of the purview of the West, that increasingly we see people in those countries have been adopting Euro-American clothing styles, right? Which ends up making it so that any sort of clothing style that doesn't fit that particular mold ends up being portrayed as kind of exotic and archaic, right? So that if you see somebody in a kimono, right, once considered to be a normal and traditional style of dress not more than 100 years ago, people oftentimes assume that it's costume in some way, right? Assume that it's, again, exotic, right? That it's not like real clothing, right? And that there's real clothing, Euro-American clothing, which is like normal clothing. And that there's then everything else, which is ethnic clothing, right? Or exotic clothing, or clothing meant to be, for a performance, right? And this sort of mindset, right? And the fact that all over the world people are dressing in increasingly Euro-American fashion is not an example of the fact that Euro-American clothing is superior, right? Or has more functionality, right? Or is better looking. But this is an indication of the processes of kind of cultural normalization on a global level. And it's not a coincidence that the clothing that's being adopted worldwide is Euro-American clothing, as opposed to being, that all of us are starting to show up to class every day in kimonos ourselves, right? And we oftentimes misread that, right, as somehow a sign of development, right? That countries where most people dress in Euro-American clothing are somehow more developed than countries in which most people dress in other clothing, right? So, cultural imperialism, then, is a really important concept for understanding the relationship between knowledge and power, especially as it pertains to identity, globalization, cultural exchange, and neocolonization, right? So again, as I said, if the formal military and political relations of imperialism have long ended in most parts of the world, yet these unequal effects of imperialism remain, right, that we haven't seen them decrease or go away, we must ask ourselves, well, what's taking place that maintains this, right? Now, cultural imperialism is one way of discussing, in other words, how new forms of cultural exchange really favor the West, and including, in addition to the new forms of economic exchange occurring under globalization. So, there's a number of ways to frame and understand the workings and role of cultural imperialism, but the whole three-part framework for discussing systematic oppression is really useful here. So cultural imperialism promotes the behavior of non-Western individuals who take up cultural practices imposed by the West, right? So for example, the increased wearing of Euro-American clothing, the increased desire to lighten your skin to be whiter around the world. Next, cultural imperialism relies on institutional practices like the free exchange of economic and intellectual material globally and the overwhelming ownership of global media outlets by the West. Right? And finally, cultural imperialism also emerges from a set of ideological beliefs regarding the superiority of Western cultural values, practices, imaginaries, and artifacts. And each one of these highlights one part of the systemic oppression framework, but looking at it kind of as operating on a global scale and not just a national scale. Now, cultural imperialism can be further related to representation, as its ideology and individual behaviors are reflected in the representational practices of the West, right? Now, these representational practices rely on the very intentional misrepresentation, right, of non-Western societies, right, underrepresentation and misrepresentation operating at once. And through these practices of underrepresentation and misrepresentation, position Western society and culture as superior. Now, since these representations are powerful, they lead to harmful results if they do not accurately reflect a people and their understandings of their culture, right? Again, representation should try and reflect the complexity of a particular culture or set of people, and ideally be representations that come from that very set of people themselves. Now, one example to really help us highlight this can be found in theories on Orientalism. Now, who's heard the term Orientalism before? Yeah? What comes to mind when you think about the term?
I kind of think about like romanticism, Oriental things.
Yeah.
Kind of like referring to people as Oriental, even though like you shouldn't.
Should never do that, right? Yeah. So Oriental as a term for people or a group of people, or as an adjective for like, a food or something like this, is considered pejorative. It's a very outdated term, right? And we're going to talk about where that term comes from, right? But folks, I'm assuming many of you are familiar with hearing something like Oriental dressing, right? Or has anybody ever heard the phrase Oriental curry powder? So Oriental dressing and Oriental curry powder are both British inventions that essentially tried to combine the flavors of a bunch of different countries throughout Asia into a single thing. And then, people really believe that this is like a real thing coming from the Orient, right? So the term Orientalism, comes from this binary between the Orient and the Occident, right? These are old terms for talking about East and West. So if anybody's ever heard of Occidental College in Los Angeles, it's because it's on the West Coast, because it's in the West. So you have the Orient or the East, right? And you have the Occident or the West. And nobody really hears the term Occident or Occidental anymore, right? But Oriental and Occidental are considered opposites, right? And the concept of Orientalism refers to the misrepresentation of the East, right, by the West that displays the East or the Orient as a place caught in the past, underdeveloped, culturally outdated, universally the same, and ultimately in need of saving by the West, right? And this happens all the time. You see superhero movies that take place in just some unnamed Arab generic location, right, that kind of could be Arab, could be like South Asian, kind of could be maybe Eastern European, but you're not really sure. But it's okay, because these guys are terrorists, right? But they don't really talk about where they're from or anything like this. But you're like, I believe it, because I've seen this image time and time and time and time again, right? And so this is really what Orientalism is all about, this sort of painting of the entirety of Asia and North Africa and the Middle East with this single brush, right, as being this sort of exotic place out there, caught in this sort of, as you said, this sort of romantic, glorious past, right, free from the complexities of modern-day industrial society. So who here, we can make this real simple. Who here has themselves, it's okay, or maybe if you want to project it, let's say who here has had a friend who's gone to Thailand for a week and swears that their life was changed, right? Has anybody ever had that? Like someone who's I went to Thailand and now I'm basically like a Buddhist monk, you know what I mean? And you're like, wait, I didn't know that Buddhism was the majority religion in Thailand. And they're like, well, it's not, but you know what I mean? It was a very, very sort of, cathartic, spiritual, philosophical sort of experience, right? Nobody comes from Thailand to Los Angeles and is like, man, I was in New York City for a week and it was so cathartic and philosophical and they don't talk about that, right? But this sort of attitude that traveling to these exotic other places somehow dramatically changes who we are and is this important sort of experience to be able to go there and experience other cultures, right? And that simply by having been well-traveled across, Asia and across the Middle East, right, or across Africa, makes you somehow a worldly kind of philosophical person who can think from all these sorts of different perspectives, right? This sort of attitude is very, very kind of representative of modern-day Orientalism, right? And we don't expect, and we might not even believe that somebody can have the same experience coming from, if someone were coming from Ramallah in Palestine to New York City, to be describing that as a cathartic, as a spiritual, or as a philosophical sort of experience. Now, Edward Said is the philosopher, the scholar, he passed away a bit over a decade ago, who really focused a lot on Orientalism, who really helped define the term. Do I have it here? No. So he has a book that he wrote in 1978 called Orientalism that first really defined this concept. So we're going to watch a short little 3-minute clip that explains this idea of Orientalism. And then uses that as a launching pad to talk about cultural judgment and how we ourselves engage in cultural judgment of other places and what we can learn from that, how we can change how we judge other places. So in this film, I want you to think about the systemic oppression framework and how it comes up in here. So in other words, what are some of the institutional practices being mentioned, the ideological components, what do individuals do as a result of or in relationship to Orientalism? And then also, what do you see the role of knowledge power being in the clip? In other words, At what points in the clip do you hear people talked about as generating knowledge about something, right? Who gets to generate knowledge about something? What knowledge is considered correct based off of who is generating that knowledge? So I want you to think about those things.
Welcome to the MCAT Multimedia Series, a MCAT analysis of Edward Said's Orientalism. Edward Said was one of the most important cultural figures of the late 20th century. In his 1978 book, Orientalism, Said made the influential argument that scholarly writing from America and Europe presented inaccurate, misleading, and stereotyping.
I'm assuming no one here speaks Italian, maybe?
of the East. He argued that the Orient is the stage on which the whole East is confined. Said believed these biased perceptions hindered a true understanding of Middle Eastern and East Asian culture. To understand Said's theory, let's imagine a scholarly university professor writing an academic report on the party scene. For research purposes, he decides to go to a party. When he arrives, the party is in full swing. Most guests are casually dressed and dancing to loud electronic dance music. Others are sitting around lounging on the floor, kissing and laughing. The whole situation is alien to the professor. He has his own set of values and finds it difficult to understand or appreciate the behavior of the partygoers. He can't identify himself with them or understand what made them who they are. In the same way, Said argued, when Western scholars studied Eastern culture, they couldn't understand it because it differed from their own. So they portrayed the East as exotic, enigmatic, and curious, judging and romanticizing it without ever understanding it. Deep down, the professor feels his values are justified. After all, he is an academic. His distaste for the partygoer's lifestyle confirms to him that his perspective is correct. He publishes his report, portraying the partygoers as raucous, sensual, uncultured, and unintelligent, because they deviated from his own personal values. Just as the professor saw himself as superior to the partygoers, Said believed the West thought its society was superior to Eastern society. But Said went further. He thought Western scholarship held strong ties to the domineering imperialist societies that produced it, concluding that much Western scholarship was inherently political and intellectually dubious. Said argued that stereotyping became a justification for the Western colonization of Eastern countries. The West painted a picture of an Eastern world that needed civilizing. Invasion was framed as salvation, rescuing the inhabitants who were too lazy and too pleasure-focused to be fit to govern themselves. Said deduced that either the West is blinded by its own failings and doesn't recognize it in stereotyping, or it believes its own culture is superior. Edward Said's book became the foundational text for post-colonial studies and transformed Middle Eastern studies. His theory still remains critically relevant today, so much so that it has become part of our language. The term Orientalism describes a patronizing Western attitude towards other cultures. A more detailed examination can be found in the MCAT analysis.
All right, so let's talk about this last one first, the role of knowledge power being in the clip. So who gets to generate knowledge, at this moment in time that Said was talking about? Whose knowledge is considered correct, authoritative, truth, capable of being acted on in ways that use power, exert power, take power, yeah? Right, and specifically in this case, the example they use is, like, who's the guy who's creating knowledge in this? Well, Said is, yeah, this is about his work, but in the example they used of the party, right, that this person goes to, it's a professor, right? It's a university professor that goes to the party, right? Because if you think about it, like, who is considered, like, the ultimate source of knowledge on something would be a university professor. Right? Somebody could ask me something about like I don't know, how to speak Italian, and if I were to venture a totally blind guess, people would still somehow take me more seriously than somebody else, right? Because of this association of formal education with authoritative knowledge, right? So if you can imagine this is actually what was taking place in the 1700s, in the 1800s. You had academics from England, from all over Europe, traveling to Africa, to the Middle East, to Asia, and essentially just going there and taking notes on what was happening and describing it, right, in their own words from their own perspective, right? Now, if you were to have never heard of break dancing, right? Never heard of it before, right? Don't know what it's about, don't know where it emerges from, its cultural background, its meanings, its importance, right? And you were to go and write an article on break dancing. How might you describe what's taking place? Like as a group of men standing in a circle, letting off occasional warlike chants while somebody spins on their head, wildly flailing their legs around them in circle with no clear commitment to consistency or a set of principles, no understanding of tempo, rhythm, beat, right? It's a bit harsh, but realistically you might, right? And that's what that example is meant to illustrate, that this professor and professors and academics from all over Europe in the 1700s and 1800s were coming there, right, and describing things from their own perspective, right? And this led to descriptions of people across Africa, across the Middle East and Asia as being barbaric, as being uncivilized, right? Because of all of these unexamined assumptions about what constitutes civilization, right? So, for example, if we think about back to the clothing argument, right, that we still think, and I bet many of us here have fallen victim to this thinking, right, that having clothing, right, if the main clothing in a country is not Euro-American clothing, that's automatically a sign, a visual sign that they are not as civilized, not as developed, right, not as modern as, let's say, the United States, right? This is a perfect example of how that sort of works, right? Because we're not examining the fact that our very notion of what constitutes civility, right, civilization, is already built into what we think of as being proper clothing, right? And that there's actually nothing about what we wear that makes one particular group of people or another more or less developed, right? Okay, so now I would also add here, right, if we think about this then in terms of knowledge power to really continue to explore this relationship, then what Sade was saying was all of this knowledge that was being generated by Western academics in the 17 and 1800s was then used to justify exercises of power through colonialism, right? And as the movie said, this was oftentimes narrated as being about salvation, right? Which oftentimes actually involved the sending in of religious missionaries on what were called like civilizing missions, right? And so everybody who was in power in these colonial countries, if you wanted to remain in power, you had to adopt these sorts of Western value systems at the time. And that laid the early groundwork for what we see now. Like, for example, to continue the kind of clothing example, in a lot of African colonies, right, during the 1900s, late 1800s, 1900s, if you wanted to be in power as an African person in the colonial government, you had to start wearing a suit and a tie, right, and dressing in a suit and a tie, as opposed to in what would be considered more traditional styles of clothing for the country that you're in, right? And then what that ended up doing over time is essentially defining the very aesthetic of wealth and power and civilization as being this Western aesthetic of a suit and a tie, right? And we see this now because I don't know if anybody's heard about these recent debates around employers' ability to regulate dreadlocks. I don't know if anybody's heard this, right? But a lot of employers have tried to prohibit employees from having dreadlocks. Many have used the argument that it's an issue of sanitation, right? And so far in a lot of states, employers have been allowed to prohibit dreadlocks or fire employees if they insist on growing them. And a lot of other employers say they think they don't look professional, right? And this is because the very idea of what a professional haircut is, right, has been essentially, who's rocking it? Pretty much like the same thing, right? This now high comb over sort of thing with like the gradual fade to the sides. Like I could go into any office building and I could be okay with this cut, right? This wouldn't stop me from getting a job, right? But this very idea of what we think professional hair or professional clothing is built off of this sort of history, right, of colonialism and ideas about non-Western clothing being uncivilized in some sort of way. So all of this conceptual talk about cultural imperialism, globalization, transnationalism is all intended to essentially set us up to start thinking now about, well, okay, what's happening on a global level? What's happening to women? Does a woman need to be in the United States or in Europe to technically be affected by Western culture? And if the answer is no, how are women in non-Western places being affected by Western culture? Now, if we look to the question of the hijab, right, our readings are going to be looking at it from two ways. We're going to be looking at it from two ways. On one hand, the ways in which Western values around the hijab are affecting Muslim women in non-Western places, but also at the ways in which Muslim women who live in the West, in the case of the articles for this week, in Austin, Texas, and in France, for the two different articles we have on the hijab, how women living in the West who do wear hijab, or Muslim women living in the West who do not wear hijab, why do they make those decisions? What pressures are they under? What sort of ideologies are circulating about religion, about civilization, about femininity, about stuff like this? So when we look at the wearing of the hijab by Muslim women, it provides us with a case study in culture and identity which begins to touch on the transnational, because even when we're talking about a woman in the United States, right, wearing or not wearing hijab, we're talking about questions and debates and value systems that have transnational reach, right? Because they're built into ideas of what's considered Western, what's considered civilized, right? And in contrast, what's considered non-Western or uncivilized. So these help us think of culture as a global space of intersecting identities. And in the readings, you'll see that religion and gender are these two major sort of identity categories that these women are talking about when expressing their various views on the hijab. Now you'll also see culture as a global space for reiterating gendered norms. So you want to think about the ways in which different entities are saying women should be doing this, right? In which there's some entities saying women should not wear the hijab, right? In the case of the article talking about the burqa and hijab bans in France, right? Other times where you'll see people saying women should wear the hijab in the case of people who are very religiously pious, right? And then you'll also see this more feminist approach, right, that a lot of Muslim women are expressing, which says that every woman should be able to make those decisions for herself. And that would be this sort of culture as a global space for challenging gendered norms. So a number of different issues that are at work in the articles when we're talking about and thinking about the hijab. So first off is the effects of Orientalism. How are women being affected by Western cultural norms that relate to freedom and individualism, right? Then also looking at religious norms in addition to those gender norms. Looking at assimilation narratives, so how are women in the West kind of told that they should assimilate to Western cultural aesthetics, cultural norms? And then we're going to be seeing also a lot of countercultural narratives. So in what ways do women push back against some of these assimilationist narratives and say, no, we're going to do this, and we're going to do it for a different reason. I'm going to wear the hijab because I want to, and not because you, the male imam, is telling me I should, right? And all of this really relates back to location. Right, these women are differently located in the U.S., in Canada, in the case of the documentary that we're going to watch some of on Thursday, so in the West, in the Middle East, right? And where they are located affects how they understand things. Now, I think, yeah, I should be okay to get through this. I'm gonna go through this quickly. Okay, so now, in contrast to cultural imperialism, which is essentially saying, I am from the West and I know that my values are better, my culture is better, and I'm going to force it onto you and insist that you abide by it in various ways, cultural relativity is kind of the exact opposite, right? Cultural relativity is being like, you know what, everybody's different, every culture is different, it's all relative. Yeah, in the Middle East, there's some places where women have to wear hijab, but here in the United States, you know, women have to have a perfectly fit bikini body, and they're both just as bad, and it's all relative, right? So this would be cultural relativism. It's essentially refusing to make judgment because of the assumption that everything is relative to the place that it's from, right? And therefore not subject to judgment from the outside. And cultural relativity is kind of just as bad as cultural imperialism because it prevents us from being able to make ethical arguments about something being bad, right? Or perhaps about something being worse than something else. So instead, for this class, right, and what a lot of our authors are trying to do is instead engage in what we call cultural reflexivity. So this is a middle ground between cultural imperialism and cultural relativity. Cultural reflexivity is, quote, making sure not to force cultural norms onto other locations, while at the same time not utilizing a hands-off cultural relativism that renders all cultural practices particular to a certain place or people and ignores their harmful material effect. And this quote is coming directly out of one of your readings for this week. So when we're thinking about the veil and the hijab, right, and the burqa in these readings, you want to be asking yourself, what are some ways in which the narratives about the veil are culturally imperialist, taking Western cultural values and forcing them onto people, right? And then you also want to ask, what are the ways in which narratives about the veil are culturally relative, right? So in other words, people saying, well, you know, each person, each place does it their own way, and that's just fine. So, so when we're thinking about cultural reflexivity, to kind of round it out with this example of the hijab and the bikini body and stuff, right? We need to be able to say that what is happening in the Middle East to women who occasionally are targeted and sometimes killed for refusing to wear the hijab is really bad. We need to be able to also say that what's happening to women in the West and the United States, where they feel forced to have this sort of perfect bikini body and judged for not having it in a lot of ways that can be socially ostracizing and even lead to body, to eating disorders, body image issues, suicide, right? We can also say that's really bad. We don't need to get into some sort of argument about it's worse there or it's worse here, because at the end of the day, that doesn't get us anywhere, and it ends up kind of falling back and relying on these sort of culturally imperialistic belief systems. Instead, what we can say is that more people should be involved in general in trying to change all of these things, right? Rather than getting weighed down in arguments or using logic like, well, why are you wasting your time arguing about, women in bikinis here when there's women being, killed for not wearing a hijab somewhere else in the world, right? This sort of logic assumes that there's only a limited amount of labor and time and energy that can be put into organizing for change or talking about what things are wrong, and that therefore we should be prioritizing this other thing. So, real quick, for your readings for this week, there's one that's on D2L and there's one that's from your book. It's a little split week. So the first one, To Veil or Not to Veil, comes from your book, and it focuses on Muslim women in Austin, Texas, as they navigate their identities relative to and through the veil. The article examines the various motivations women have for veiling, and it looks also at where different narratives about the veil emerge from, some coming from religious elites, others coming from regular Muslim women. So you want to look and pay attention to the different justifications women provide for veiling or for not veiling, because they're not always the same, and different women feel differently about the question, right? Even though this article is about just Muslim women. So how does living in the U.S. affect some of these women's perspectives of the veil? And then finally, what attitudes do Muslim women have towards other Muslim women who choose to veil or not veil differently? In other words, the article spends some time talking about how women who do veil feel about Muslim women who don't veil, or how Muslim women who don't veil feel about Muslim women who do veil. So I want you to pay attention to that, and I think about that in terms of cultural reflexivity and feminism. Next, the next article is examining the French hijab and burqa bans through reflexive cultural judgment. So this is the article that really talks about cultural reflexivity. And in the article, which talks about these bans in France and the different arguments for and against them, Fredette outlines her notion of reflexive cultural judgment. This article itself is also a practice in cultural reflexivity, as the author herself, towards the end of the article, reflects on her own limited perspectives as a Westerner on the issue of the hijab. Now, the questions for this article is really, what is reflexive cultural judgment? How is it defined? Why is it important? How do the French bands, or what do the French bands reveal about French political and gender ideologies? And finally, how do the bands get promoted as feminist by some people, even though this article concludes that the bands are not feminist? All right, so that does it. If anybody has any questions about the extra credit or anything else, come on up.